So welcome to this afternoon on climate change leadership. We are a research group here, about 15 persons working. Mikael Karlsson is my name, but now it's time for the vice-chancellor, Anders Hagfeldt. Please give him a warm applause.
Dear Professor Aarti Gupta, dear Professor Frank Biermann, dear Niklas Zennström, dear colleagues and friends. The world is getting warmer, climate zones are shifting, water consumption is changing. The Paris Agreement, which inspired hope, is being questioned and once again abandoned by the US. So the trend is anything but positive. In short, the impacts of climate change are massive, frightening and increasing. From a scientific perspective, this may seem odd. The relationship between carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and warming has been known ever since Svante Arrhenius, who, after his doctoral thesis here in Uppsala, went on to work in Stockholm, and he wrote an article in which he became the first to define and to model the greenhouse effect. And the model is fairly accurate still today, actually. That article was published in 1896. So now it is 2025, and there is very little to indicate that we will meet the 1.5 degree target set in the Paris Agreement. Sweden, formerly a pioneering country, has also lost ground, and the Climate Policy Council writes, the government's current climate policy will not suffice to meet Sweden's climate targets and EU commitments for 2030. Some measures decided and announced in 2024 were steps in the right direction, but they do not outweigh other decisions taken during the government's term of office that have contributed to increased emissions, especially in the transport sector. But all is not doom and gloom. The Climate Policy Council also reports that in 2023, emissions fell sharply in the EU and also slightly in the US. Although emissions continue to rise in emerging economies such as India and China, global emissions growth has slowed, and there are signs that fossil fuel emissions will peak in the next few years, mainly due to reduced coal use and the continued strong growth of renewable energy. They mentioned the transition to fossil-free industry and the EU's ongoing negotiations on a new climate target for 2040 to accelerate the pace of the transition. As a solar cell researcher, I follow the installation of solar panels around the world. The installation of solar electricity last year corresponds to more than one nuclear power plant installed per week. And it doubles every third year, and it has done so for quite some time. This is tremendous and, of course, mostly positive development. The problems now for solar lies in recycling and in production, where the extraction of earth metals is a major negative factor. So we have the positive and the negative. On the one hand, on the other hand. To a large extent, this is probably what has brought us to the situation we are now in. Science is not always good at pointing to solutions. Within the university, we have now set up an institute to work on these problems. As part of the Uppsala University Future Institutes initiative, we have UNICORN, the Uppsala University Conflicting Objectives Research Nexus, devoted to promoting interdisciplinary research on conflicting goals in sustainable development. My hope is that the Institute will quickly find the creative solutions needed to take steps in the right direction. I believe very much in these institutes, just as I believe in the importance of our visiting professors in climate leadership. There are strong points of contact here. It is thanks to the generous grants from Zennström Philanthropies that the professorship was created, and the continued support has been invaluable, of course. The visiting professors have contributed in various ways to raising the level of dialogue on climate policy issues in our country, as well as internationally. The profiles of the professors have varied, and so has their way of engaging. I think it's important that despite the words need for clear answers, we show diversity, that we are firmly anchored in our ambition and determination, always to be a university that dares to ask the difficult questions and dares to be critical of both policy and research activities. The truth is not easy to grasp, but we can only strive to succeed. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank Stacy van der Veer, who has completed his year as visiting professor. Thank you for your commitment and your important work, which we will, of course, continue to follow. And you are always welcome back to us. I would now like to welcome Professor Frank Biermann and Professor Aarti Gupta, who will shortly introduce themselves and their research. As Vice-Chancellor of Uppsala University, I would like to extend a warm welcome to our new visiting professors. Thank you for being here. And at the same time, I would like to thank all of you who in different ways are working to fulfill the main aim and purpose of the university, to contribute to a better world. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for the nice introduction. Thanks so much all for you here at Uppsala University for inviting us. It's fantastic to be here. It's a great pleasure. It's a great pleasure to learn from this university, to work at this university. And I hope also that in the next couple of months that we will have much more opportunities also to work together on these important issues that we try to address here as the climate change leadership visiting professors, Zennström professors here at this university. It's a pleasure being here. So what I want to do in the next 20 minutes is talk a little bit about the research that I want to do in the next 4.5 months here at Uppsala University, which is planetary politics, and this is now timely, particularly in the age of Donald Trump. The rector has already started to talk about the crisis that we are all facing. And if you talk about planetary politics, we have to address with this the planetary crisis that is driving our research. Climate change is, of course, one of the drivers of the crisis that we have, and this is already outlined by the rector. There is a number of positive trends we have. But on the other hand, it's also clear that greenhouse gas emissions are still increasing, and we are not really sure that we make the 1.5-degree targets or not even the 2-degree targets. So more efforts are certainly needed, despite the progress that has been made. But it is also not only climate. It is the crisis of sustainable development. The United Nations in 2015 agreed on 17 sustainable development goals with 169 targets meant to transform our world till 2030. And last year, an assessment has been made by the United Nations, and of these 169 targets, only 17 are on track of being achieved by 2030. And 1/3 of the target, oh, that's the wrong slide. Sorry. Okay. That was too fast. Anyway, so 30% of these targets are still not stalling and are even regressing. For example, the United Nations has agreed to eradicate extreme poverty by 2030, and still 9% of the human population is still living in extreme poverty. So this is a major crisis. What we need, and I seriously believe, is we need to have better institutions. We need to have better governance. I believe this is a crisis of our economic systems, but very much also a crisis of our political systems and the crisis of governance. And to address this, I have tried to contribute to in the last 30 years of my career. I'm a political scientist, and I'm working on problems of governance, especially in my case, on problems of global governance. And I try to understand why we are in the crisis that we are and what kind of institutions and what kind of governance systems could do it better. I mean, this is a driving motivation of my research, and I'm not doing this alone. I have done this for the last 20 years in the context of a large global research network, the Earth System Governance Project. It is a network of about 700 scholars. Whoever is interested is very much welcome to join also. And these scholars in the last 20 years have collectively tried to understand the governance crisis and to understand the political crisis that we are facing. And I mention this for one reason also, because Uppsala University will now take on a very, very central role in this Earth System Governance project, because the entire project requires a coordination unit. It requires a secretariat. It requires what we call an international project office. And this international project office is now being hosted here at Uppsala University, actually in this building. It's just a few rooms from here. And it was made possible, thanks also a lot for the generous contribution of Uppsala University and various institutions, and also Zennström Philanthropies. They have made it possible to bring this network to Uppsala, and here for the next 5 years, the entire network will be hosted by Uppsala University. I think it's a fantastic development. The community is extremely happy, and I hope that also many of you at Uppsala will be happy in the next years with these new developments. But I want to focus on my own research here at Uppsala in the next 5 months on issues of planetary politics. So I want to dive much deeper into the political problems, the underlying politics of Earth system governance, understanding what's really good and wrong in these kind of governance systems. And I understand planetary politics as politics which is not understood from the national perspective. It's understood from a planetary perspective, in a post-international and maybe even a post-humanist perspective. I want to focus on power. I want to focus on inequality. I want to focus on planetary injustices and planetary justice. And I want, and this I tried to do for the last 30 years, try to develop also progressive policies that can be enacted and that can help us to deal with the planetary crisis that is driving all us in our research. That was the plan when I came here, when I expected this offer, and when I decided to come to Uppsala. And then one thing changed or added to the equation. That was Donald Trump. And that changed my entire research to some extent, because I believe that the election and the ascent to power of Donald Trump will change everything that we have done so far in Earth system governance. I think it's a major, major bifurcation in the political developments that we have. For example, you have all seen in the news, of course. I mean, the United States is leaving the World Health Organization. They are disengaging officially, formally, from the Sustainable Development Goals and saying this is all just vogue. They are leaving the Paris Agreement. Maybe they might even leave the Climate Convention as such. And they are dismantling the entire development assistance programs of the United States of America. And this is only part of the entire agenda that is now being set into motion in Washington, D.C. by Trump. And it is, of course, also not only Trump. It is a larger emergence of Trumpism, I would call. So if you look at this graph, you see, I mean, the rise of right-wing populist parties across the world in all democracies that have reached now an electorate of like 20% on average in many, many countries. Sometimes they win and are in government, like Argentina, and in the United States of America, of course, which is the biggest problem for those who are not agreeing with these political parties, because it is the largest economy, it is the largest military power, it is the remaining superpower in a sense, which is now run by such a political ideology. And for me, as a scholar of governance, of Earth system governance, of international relations, international politics, I understand this in a way as the end of what I call the long 1990s. Looking at the beginning, the Berlin Wall, where the 1990s in a sense started, the fall of the Berlin Wall, which was a very, very important moment also for me, because I was actually there. I was studying at the Free University in West Berlin at that time. So I was there when the wall was falling. It was a moment of hope. Everybody believed the world would be a better place. We don't need to invest in military anymore and anything, etc. And at the same time, also like a few years later, the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro, this big event where we signed the Climate Convention, where we signed the Biodiversity Convention, and many, many other agreements after that. And this is, I believe, now in a way, possibly all coming to an end. And the end of the long 1990s means that our hopes in the past for universal world orders might be shattered. The imaginations of linear progress that every year will be somewhat better if we try a bit harder and have better agreements, better institutions, better laws, better climate movement, that it will every year become a little bit better and we will cope with all this crisis. Now we might be faced with the regression in many governance schemes, and also, of course, the certainty of stable blocks, and in this case, particularly the transatlantic alliance. Sounds a very outdated term these days. This is all kind of changing. And what does it mean for politics? And that's what I want to address in the next couple of months here at Uppsala University. So I want to look at planetary institutions, planetary organizations, planetary justice, and planetary democracy, and this from the lengths of the age of Trump. I mean, how is Trump's election and Trump's ascent to power affecting these kind of important dimensions of planetary politics on Earth system governance? And with the remaining time, I have a few slides on each, starting with the institutions, where the past has been marked by the idea that we are working towards universal institutions, institutions that are including everybody, where all countries are working together in joint attempts of building global orders. And this is over. So I believe the future will be a future of plurilateral institutions, which means institutions where many are part of, but not necessarily all, and not the United States of America. And this is not entirely new. We had plurilateral institutions in the past. They were very important in the World Trade regime, for example, and in many other agreements. So it's not a new idea, but I believe plurilateralism has been the exception. And now it will be the rule. It will be the new normal, and we have to find answers to that. And also in the past, in the literature that has been in the climate governance domain about institutions, plurilateral institutions, clubs, climate clubs, or smaller agreements, coalitions of the willing, that was quite often understood as including the United States. The debate was very much driven actually by American scholars who had kind of the idea plurilateralism means America and some partners together. And now we have to understand plurilateralism structurally without the United States, and maybe even, as we know with the International Criminal Court, for example, against the United States. And how can we really design institutions that are plurilateral, that are not including the United States of America, that are maybe even opposed by the United States of America, and how can such institutions be effective and also fair and just at the same time? I think that's a tremendous research question, and I hope to develop some answers in the future. And the same trend you see also when you look at organizations, especially the United Nations. The United Nations has been criticized for quite some time as being outdated, because the Charter of the United Nations was set up in 1945, and essentially, that's why I always like to use these black and white photos, essentially it hasn't been changed since then. It has never really been changed in any substantial way. And it's very much kind of built on principles of the 19th centuries in a sense. I mean, this is kind of very much following how the 19th and 18th centuries politics have been done. And we need to have a new United Nations for the 21st century problems. But now the added complication is UN, which is already maybe outdated and is already weak, is under active attack by a coalition of anti-internationalist and anti-environmentalist and anti-sustainability countries. And that's a big challenge. And that means, number one, that all the big ideas that we have developed in our communities about world constitutionalism and grand order designs changes in the United Nations are probably not working out. I mean, this is not the time for really changing the Charter of the United Nations, because it will not happen, because for charter change, you would need to have the acceptance of the United States of America and of Russia, and this is very unlikely. So therefore, also here, we have to work towards plurilateral solutions within the United Nations, which is not totally new, but again, it will become the rule, it will become the main challenge, it will become the main system to work with plurilateral approaches and plurilateral alliances within the United Nations in a way that the United States of America might not agree or might not join any of the new regulation. And there are lots of opportunities that I try to develop more. For example, there's a provision in the United Nations Charter that the General Assembly by majority vote can just set up new bodies within the United Nations system. And this has been done for the Human Rights Council, for example, many others. There's lots of precedents. And I think some of these provisions can allow progressive alliances of countries to change the UN and make it stronger and make it more sustainable and make it more democratic, make it more just without the acceptance of the United States of America and other countries such as Argentina, et cetera, et cetera. And I think there's lots of possibilities, and I want to develop some of these possibilities, and I'm doing it already. The time is not enough now to think about the Planetary Protection Council that could really work and try to identify and protect the planetary boundaries and planetary commons, or to have a UN Sustainable Development Council that can work on the enforcement and monitoring of sustainable development goals. There are lots of possibilities, lots of opportunities, and we have to think about them in a new way, in a novel way that takes into account of the new geopolitical situation in which we find ourselves. And the third area, which we're very interested in, is the area of planetary justice or injustice. There's lots to be said about it. It's a very, very large research area. But just this one graph, shows in a way the injustice of our climate situation, which is very simple, that there is 50% of the poorest people on the planet which are responsible for 8% of the emissions. And the 10% of the richest people on our planet, they're responsible also for 50%. So it really shows that climate change is actually not a problem of the human species. It's not a problem of humankind. It's not a problem of the Anthropocene. It's a problem of 10%. It's 10% of all the people in the world who are causing this problem. And if everybody would have these kind of emission profiles on the lower bottom, we would not have this problem, would not be sitting here. But the point is also what can be done from the political, from the governance perspective to address this injustice and to make it a more just, fairer world and a better governance system. And that's an important agenda. I have lots to be said about it, but I'm now focusing on one important question. It's United States. They are kind of causing all problems in this, which is essentially, sounds very banal, but the bottom line is they are most likely withdrawing their entire financial support for all kind of international programs. United States, right now, it's good for about 25 to 30% of the entire official development assistance of the OECD countries. It's a big chunk. They're paying per capita much less than the Swedes, good for the Swedes, but on total, of course, it's a huge sum of money that we probably will lose. We know it already from the World Health Organization. It's not fully true what actually will be cut in the United States, but we know that the US Agency for International Development is already dismantled. Everybody has been fired in a sense, this is the start. So we have to expect much less financial support. And here I would like to maintain and start a research program of looking much more into novel ways of financing for planetary concerns. And this could be, for example, something, one example is automatic financing that is financed by large harmful activities. And the easiest one is technically air transportation, which I find very interesting because air transportation is one of the most harmful activities. And 80% of people have never been in an airplane. So it's really a very much rich person's activity. And there are lots of proposals out there, what we could do in a sense to tax aviation on passenger level or flight level. There are even some progressive proposals by having like a frequent flyer. So the more you fly, the more you pay. And some of these proposals which are out there can really generate large sums of money. And this money could be used for planetary politics, for international programs to address issues of climate injustice. This is one area which I find very interesting, also in fulfillment of SDG 10, which is the 10th SDG, which was originally meant to address inequality, to address the injustice inequalities that we have. It's actually one of the least successful SDGs. And the fourth area that I want to address in my time here at Uppsala is questions of democracy. I've been interested in this, and many of you are interested in democracy studies, also in the Zennström community, I must say. The past has been for me to think about how we can democratize the international organizations and the United Nations, for example. And I've been part of communities where we discussed having United Nations Parliamentarian Assembly or a forum of civil society, strengthening civil society, having citizen juries at the UN level. So all kind of proposals are there to try to make the UN and international organizations, international institutions more democratic. And this was all based on the assumption that countries, nation states will also be and become more democratic over time. And now the problem is we have a global trend of increasing authoritarianism. So it's only, this is one data set that 7% of the countries only are, or 7% of the global population live in a full democracy, including Sweden. And almost half of the global population lives in countries that are not described as democracies because they are either authoritarian or they are hybrid regimes and all flawed in many ways. So the trend is countries are becoming more authoritarian. And what does it mean for ideas of democratizing international organizations? Can we have a United Nations Parliamentarian Assembly if 50% of the people on the planet live in countries where we don't have a parliament or no free elections? So how can we really imagine a democratic quality of international organizations and of planetary institutions in a world where countries are becoming less and less authoritarian? I think this is one of the important questions also of our time. And this brings me also to the end, and I have 1.5 minutes left, brings me to the end of my short presentation. So I will be here, of course, for 4.5 months. I'm really looking forward of talking to many of you and have already quite a few meetings with many of you here at Uppsala, but maybe also for those of you who are coming from Stockholm, other places. I want to achieve essentially 3 things till the 31st of July when I will be leaving, which is the time when all of you are on holiday also, I believe, what I understand. So I want to kind of continue working on the issues that I have just mentioned, maybe in the direction of a small book or starting with a manuscript. I mean, I'm quite hope that I get a lot of progress on this field, something working on planetary politics in the age of Trump. And I'm very keen to learn from you also, to all kind of insights. Many of you come from similar communities, to jointly discuss some of these issues. And then, of course, I hope that this is not only restricted to 4.5 months. I really would like to build up also links with scholars here in Uppsala that go beyond the 31st of July this year. So larger collaborations on projects, on any kind of intellectual exchange that could be also lasting longer. And I think this is, I see also the former Zennström professor here who is returning, and it's like a boomerang system in a way. You know? People are just coming back apparently. And I hope to be part of this boomerang community and coming back from time to time and enjoying work here and working. And then, of course, the third part is I have been involved with the Earth System Governance Project for 20 years. I'm actually the founder of this network, have been the chair for the first 10 years. So I very much would like to help also to help the transition from where it has been now based, which is Utrecht University, where I'm normally also based, to Uppsala. The physical transition has already been done, and I'm happy to share some information and anecdotes and whatever it is to the incoming team that will now take over the International Project Office from now on for the next 5 years, which is a great opportunity for Uppsala. And having said all this, I just want to use my last non-existing minutes now to just thank everybody. I want to thank the University of Uppsala for the great possibilities that they have created of making this possible. I want to thank the Zennström philanthropies. Without this all would not be possible. I think it's a great opportunity for us as scholars to collaborate across borders and to work and bring together the two UUs, the Utrecht University and Uppsala universities. I always get confused about the acronyms. And I also want to thank particularly also the climate change leadership team. It was a really fantastic, warm welcome so far. It's great to be with you. And I'm looking forward to the next 4.5 months and more beers and more dinners and lunches and whatever we all do. And intellectual discussions, of course, on planetary politics in the age of Trump and also beyond that. Thank you so much for having us here. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Am I audible? The volume is good, not too loud, not too soft. Right. So thank you very much. Let me get my first slide on. I'd like to thank all of you for showing up here, to the Climate Change Leadership Group, to Mikael and Judith for this very warm welcome, as Frank also mentioned, to the Vice-Chancellor, to Uppsala University for welcoming us here. We are enjoying ourselves tremendously, and it's only been a couple of weeks, to Zennström Philanthropies and to Niklas Zennström for this opportunity. It's really wonderful to be here. So thank you very much. What I wanted to do with my 20 minutes is to tell you a little bit about the research that I have done and want to do, but also tell you a bit about what I want to do with my research. So I've chosen the topic of the climate crisis and scholar activism. So scholar activism is a confronting term. So it makes people, it grabs attention. I think labels can be somewhat distracting, but they can also be enticing. And so I use this notion. Essentially, my goal is to reflect a little bit on what is the responsibility of a scientist in these times of crisis? And I think that is a question that resonates with all of us here. So what is really our responsibility? And I want to do this through the lens of this notion of scholar activism. What is this? What does it mean for me? How have I tried to engage in a form of activism? Why is it necessary? And what kinds of challenges it brings with it? So with that, of course, the idea of what is the role of a scientist and what does responsibility in science mean is not a new question. It's been debated for at least 50 years in a whole range of fields. It's been analyzed in the philosophy of science, sociology of science, science and technology studies, through this notion of a science-society contract, asking questions such as, what can society expect from science? What does science owe to society? And what are actually the mutual benefits to be gained from these interactions? And what is the nature of the interaction between science and society? So long-standing deliberations on these questions, and many, many important insights conceptualizing this relationship. One core conclusion, we can say we are at this point in time, the conclusion is that the ivory tower is over, just to put it very simply. So there is this idea, the old idea, that you leave scientists to do their thing and benefits to society will automatically flow. That idea is over. Now there's really an understanding that there has to be an interaction, an engagement, and with notions such as mission-oriented science, policy-relevant science, regulatory science, or science for impact, which is a notion that my university, Wageningen University in the Netherlands, also is very much focused on. So that is the conclusion, but it is still very much an open question, a challenging question. What is actually the appropriate and fruitful and responsible way to engage, for a scientist to engage? So that question, I think, is still very much open. And that this question is even more challenging, I think, in this realm of research where I have focused for the last 20 years or so. I don't want to date myself too much, but I have, my background is global environmental governance and politics, international relations. So similar sort of background as Frank. And what I have looked at are particularly issue areas where, in fact, there is fundamental scientific contestation about the way forward to address our triple planetary crises, to address the climate problem. And so this is not a situation where there's a consensus in science and the only challenge is how to bring this message over to society. I'm looking at issues where scientists fundamentally disagree about the way forward. And that could be associated with, for example, the use of novel technologies to address the climate crisis, speculative options which haven't yet materialized. So another dimension of this problem is that any potential harm or any potential benefits associated with speculative technologies also hasn't materialized. So it lies in the future. So, and could potentially be unpredictable and very unequally distributed, these harms or benefits. So that is the area of research where I have focused, and that has been my research trajectory so far, to really look at issue areas which are characterized by scientific conflict, contestation, controversy, and where harm might lie in the future. And so therefore, where anticipatory or ex ante forms of governance are needed. Frank was talking about governance, so steering towards desired futures, steering in order to avoid future harm or generate future benefits. But how do you steer in the present? How do you develop governance institutions in the present to steer towards a future that hasn't yet materialized? That's been my research endeavor. And so what I've tried to do, I will make this less abstract by pointing to an example of where I have focused my research efforts within the climate area, and where these dimensions of the problem are really exemplified. And that is a set of speculative novel technologies that are now being debated as a way to address accelerating climate impacts. And that is the issue of the speculative set of technologies to dim the sun, or proposals that would reflect some kind of technological interventions that would reflect some incoming sunlight back out into space as a way to have a cooling effect on the climate, as a way to counteract warming. And one of these solar geoengineering technologies that are being debated also within the scientific community is to inject reflective particles like sulfate aerosols into the stratosphere as a way to reflect some incoming sunlight and have a cooling effect, and to do this over decades or centuries. Now, I don't know how many of you have heard about or familiar with or have engaged with these ideas around solar geoengineering, but it might sound quite scary. It might sound semi-science fiction, but it is increasingly becoming normalized, this discussion, and it raises a whole range of questions around governance, around essentially what would it mean to have a planetary scale intervention into complex and non-linear climate systems that sustain over decades or centuries with unpredictable and regionally unequally distributed consequences? What would be the ecological climate impacts of that, but what would be the geopolitical risks and other sorts of risks? And what if such an intervention would suddenly need to stop? You would see a spike in global temperatures. So this is the kind of debate that is happening around solar geoengineering as a way to address climate change. And scientists fundamentally disagree about the risks and the possible benefits that this might pose, and whether, in fact, we need to have on the table the option of solar geoengineering to address the climate crisis, or whether having the option on the table will make climate impacts worse. That's a fundamental divide. And associated with this divide is the question of governance. Should we be devising rules, regulations, global governance arrangements in the present in order to enable the development of such a technology, or to restrict its development? So governance could have these very polar opposite objectives, to enable or to restrict. So this is the arena in which I have been doing. So my research here on this topic has looked at precisely these scientific contestations. For example, this one article where we tried, together with a number of people, Frank was also involved in this, we tried to map what these expert visions of the future are, which include solar geoengineering or don't include solar geoengineering, which is a more climate safe future, and what then are the associated governance proposals with these very, very polar opposite visions of a climate safe future. And we mapped these different proposals to say, some argue, some scientists say we should enable this technology, some say we should restrict it. And I'm in that latter category. And so I've also looked at, for example, sorry, that was a bit too quick. Also looked at other ways in which I've been very interested. I have a science and technology studies background as well, in looking at the politics of expertise. So how are a small group of scientists advocating for solar geoengineering also talking about equity in a very narrow, in my view, problematic way, or to draw attention to how authoritative assessments about these technologies actually frame the possibilities, the risks, and the benefits, and that has consequences for formal governance. So experts have a lot of influence and power here. And if that is the case, then at some moment, it became obvious to me that I don't want to only just publish articles about this and lay out my perspective on it, but actually the stakes are so high, and we are at this juncture in time where we could either move towards developing these planet-altering technologies or restricting them. Because once a technology is developed, it's very difficult to put it back into the bottle. And once a technology is developed, it will be deployed. History teaches us that. So this sounds as a crucial moment in which to come out, if one was ever in the ivory tower, to say, I wanted to bring my critical perspective into the policy arena. So this is a move towards scholar activism. And this, again, I have relatively little time right now. So of course, there's a lot of debate also about what this notion means. But I just want to specify what my understanding and my type of scholar activism has been. It has these 4 ingredients. Now, this looks like some Indian spices here, 4 spicy ingredients, but it's not that fiery and spicy. It's actually, I think, quite reasonable, I would say. But maybe the first ingredient is the most controversial, is that if there is a polarization within the scientific community, to come out actively and make clear what your stance is. And that's what I have done, to take a clear position on one or the other side of a controversial issue, but then also not to just stay within, that's my individual position, and to try to bring that into various decision-making arenas, but to also coalesce a broader academic collective around critical perspectives on this, and to bring a collective voice into the policy arena. And then finally, the third ingredient is to, of course, bring this academic critical perspective that takes a clear position, says, in fact, take this option off the table. We shouldn't be developing it, calling on political actors to take this option off the table. And then the fourth ingredient is to embed this position, of course, in continuing research, because it's research-based advocacy. And ultimately, the goal is to change the nature of the conversation and to influence the direction that policy goes in. So I'll just say very briefly a few things about each of these, taking a clear position. This was, while it was still called Twitter, I had a tweet about my position. So I'm just sharing that because it encapsulates the different elements of my position. And basically what my view on this technology is that a speculative and highly risky techno-promise like solar geoengineering is politically and ecologically a dangerous distraction from what we actually need to do to address climate change, which is to reduce entrenched inequalities and align our politics to help realize a just transition globally. So the idea, so to emphasize here that it's not just ecologically dangerous, but also politically dangerous, because it's in our geopolitically fraught world, whose hand would be on the global thermostat? Who would decide about planet-altering technologies like solar geoengineering? These political questions are very important to ask. And that's related to the normative concerns that underpin my research. Why am I an academic, and why do I choose the subjects that I choose to research? And what do I want to shine a light on with my research is essentially to say that technologies don't land in a vacuum, in a political vacuum, and they are not neutral, but they will land in the grossly unequal world that we find ourselves in. The world is a very, very unequal place. Frank was talking about this. This, I think, picture captures that. And for me, the questions, the fundamental political and normative questions that we need to shine a light on, both through our advocacy and through our research, is whose voice will be heard, whose perspectives will matter, who will win, who will lose, who will have a seat at the table, and who is actually calling for solar geoengineering, whose interests does this serve? So those are the questions around which my position on this is grounded. And this is then the second ingredient, the collective scholar activism around. So fortunately, there are other academics who have very critical positions on solar geoengineering. And so the idea was, as some of us saw in the early 2020s, that there was growing attention in mainstream media and in some fora for this option, especially pushed by a small group of advocates of solar geoengineering. It's a small group, but they're supported by some very rich people, Silicon Valley billionaires, etc. So they have deep pockets, they have access. And we were very worried about this. And we thought it's very important to also, it's a responsibility of critical scientists to bring their perspectives into the space. So we created this platform, an academic platform, which brings critical voices together and calling essentially for a non-use agreement on solar geoengineering. It was launched in 2022. Frank was also very much involved with this. And it offers an open letter which lays out our core concerns about solar geoengineering, and academics are invited to sign this open letter. So it started with 16 academics, and now we are at 540 plus signatories of this open letter, calling for this non-use from 67 countries, and more than 2,000 civil society organizations have also endorsed this initiative. So we keep signatories, academic signatories, separate from civil society endorsements. But this just goes to show that a scattered critique of this idea has been powerfully coalesced under this platform, which goes to show that there is actually much more concern about this technology than might be evident if you read a mainstream news article which talks about the perspective of the few who are more visible, until our initiative sort of tried to. So what we do, I was talking about mainstream news media, we have essentially tried to change the framing in news media, where also the critical questions that we ask, the political questions, not just the The technology-related questions are aired about governance, etc. So all of these, the news media has that's a core arena of engagement for us. We use our platform, our website also to follow developments, policy developments in this space and to inform about them. For example, African countries in a UN negotiation calling for non-use, some of the countries most vulnerable to climate change, or Vanuatu, a small island developing state, calling for non-use of solar geoengineering to take this option off the table. So we use this, and our civil society organizations also are spread across the globe. So there's this, this is the way in which our academic platform works, and then we try to bring this position into various arenas. And so I'll just give some examples of how I've tried to do that. So this is talking to journalists and policymakers, where citizens come together to debate issues of the time, but also going to the UN General Assembly Science Summit, where we bring governments, indigenous communities, academics together to discuss non-use, but also going to the climate COPs and talking to youth movements, etc. So with that, and of course, this is grounded in research-based advocacy. So it's research-based, so we write articles. This was something that launched, laid out the initial reasons for calling for non-use, but then also we have gone on to look at other types of research, which we can learn from other areas of restrictive governance. Something seems to be happening here. Okay. And so we try to elaborate on our reasoning, our rationales. You might notice here that Stacey Vanderveer is also a partner in crime in this initiative. So somehow the Zennström professors are very engaged in this topic. I don't know what that says about the topic of the Zennström professors, but, and so finally, I'd also promised to comment a little bit on the challenges, navigating key challenges. There are any number of experiences that we've had. It's now in our 4th year of this academic initiative calling for non-use, and it's been a wild ride, very adventurous. And I could comment on, I think these are topics for many FICAs with all of you, but I will just point out a few things. What is really core that's continually being negotiated is what does actually expertise and evidence mean in this area? If you're going to say, let's make evidence-based decisions, and you're advocating for a certain position, whose expertise counts and what counts as evidence, especially in an area where harm and benefit is all lying in the future? That's been a core issue for us, and something that has to be continually negotiated, and to say that governance, ethics, indigenous perspectives, radical critique, all has a role to play. And then finally, all of the other points I laid out, credibility is an important one. Am I undermining my credibility as a scientist by taking a clear position? And I think absolutely not. I'm convinced now that we've retired this idea that there's neutrality associated with the scientific enterprise. Another challenge is co-optation. How do I deal with the risk that you're the token critical voice in an arena which is stacked against you? Do you decide to engage in the hope of changing the conversation or not? Then another one is the capacity to be an activist. For those of us who are saying we should not be going down this path, this sort of advocacy is in addition to our normal academic work. Whereas those who are advocating to develop this technology, they are professionally, that's their professional focus. They spend all of their time on that. So there's an imbalance in capacity and time to engage. And also polarization and critique. What is really the role of critique, and does critique polarize? So this is another important question about, we've been told that by bringing this non-use academic collective, you have polarized the scientific community. But then the question is, who gets to polarize? And if you don't polarize, you acquiesce to an unequal status quo. And finally, it's about hope. There's a lot of discussion about where is the hope, who's a pessimist, who's an optimist. If you have a critical perspective, are you taking away hope? And my final concluding sentence on that is that I think a critical perspective is the embodiment of hope, that you actually believe that something can change. I think pessimism is an unaffordable luxury. We can't afford to have, and misplaced optimism I don't believe in, one that denies an unjust status quo. So with that, I wanted to end by talking just for a second about the Trumpian, not the age, but the moment, perhaps, hopefully. And because I've been talking about scholar activism, but if the scholar itself is threatened, then of course we are having a different conversation. So this is about the end of the university as we know it, all these, the assault on science that we've heard about. But I think there's no better place than Uppsala University, which is headed towards its jubileum, 550 years of Uppsala University, to say academia will endure, the scientist will endure. And this is a quote from the vice-chancellor saying that the ultimate goal is to make a difference in society. And I hope, as the Zennström professor here, to be able to do this with all of you. And my writing project will be to actually explore this also, this phenomenon, to analyze it more. And here I would like to invite anybody who's also engaged in scholar activism of various kinds, whatever label you use to describe yourselves, to join me in this, and we could maybe do something together. And for the rest, I will help with embedding the Earth System Governance project. I'm also part of the scientific steering committee of this. And finally, of course, maybe the fourth point is the most important one. I want to learn about these almost nearly perfect people. Thank you so much. Yeah.
So thank you very much for that, Frank and Aarti. I invite the panelists to come up here. So we will start with a small panel before Frank and Aarti will come back. And after that, I will invite all of you to be part of the discussion. Okay, so we have invited a panel with four Uppsala researchers who will take on the global planetary crisis and describe that a bit. Think about what the role of scientists is in this context, and also reflect on the introductory inaugural lectures. I want to start with the triple planetary crisis is usually referred to as the climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis, and the pollution crisis, which are three problems that all interact in various ways, both when it comes to problems and measures to cope with them. And first, Gabriele Messori, you're a professor here at the Department of Earth Sciences, focusing on climate change and extreme weather. I would like to ask you, what is known today about climate change-induced extreme weather, and what are the impacts that we talk about? What does science say today?
So we clearly know that we are facing increasing climate hazards. This has already happened and will continue to happen in the foreseeable future. And by climate hazards, I mean climate situations which have the potential to cause harm. And yes, better now? That can cause harm. This can be harm to society, harm to the economy, harm to natural systems. What I would argue we know less of is the concrete impacts, because in many ways it is a lot harder to measure an impact than to measure a climate event. For example, it is a lot easier to measure the temperature of a heat wave than it is to measure how many people died because of that heat wave. And so I would argue that this is a key knowledge gap that we have. However, we do have evidence that climate extremes and dangerous climate conditions are causing increasing damage. On the bright side, we also have evidence that they are causing decreasing numbers of deaths. And this is not because the climate hazards are becoming less severe, but it's because we humans are becoming better at dealing with climate extremes and dangerous climate conditions in general. So there was a very nice report by the World Meteorological Organization recently stating that we are seeing increasing climate damage, but decreasing deaths. And I think this highlights that the issue of climate extremes and climate impacts is very much an intertwined physical and societal issue. And in this, I think that the Zennström visiting professorships can be a very valuable tool in bringing together the physical part of the problem and the societal part of the problem to get a holistic perspective on the climate crisis and its consequences.
Thank you very much. We move to the next, let's call it problem, or the next crisis. Jakob Höglund, you're professor of animal conservation biology across the street here. Tell us about the biodiversity crisis and how that impacts on our societies today.
Yes, I will try, Mikael. But we know that ever since life formed on Earth about 4 billion years ago, or the oldest known fossils are about 3.7 billion years. Biodiversity has increased generally, so there are more and more life forms, and we call this evolution. There have been 5 major crises throughout the Earth's history, and that's when biodiversity has decreased. And scientists, mainly geologists, know why. To a large extent, it's either volcanoes or celestial impacts that have changed the climate and other consequences. Now we're facing a 6th major extinction event, and we know that this one is not caused by celestial impact or by volcanic eruptions. It's caused by one species that inhabits the Earth, that is Homo sapiens, or humans. And the research that we are doing at the Evolutionary Biology Center is trying to understand, why do species go extinct? Why do life forms disappear? And we know that there are life forms still, there's speciation, making more biodiversity, but we're losing biodiversity as we speak. And that is what we are trying to understand, and the causes and consequences of that. And of course, this is tied to climate change, but it's not the only reason for why species go extinct. So we have other anthropogenic impacts that we need to understand, this complex relationships and what makes some species resilient and what makes some species go extinct. That's basically what we're trying to do.
Thank you very much. We move to Joëlle Rüegg. You're also across the street here, professor in ecotoxicology, and focus on endocrine disrupting chemicals and other pollutants. What do we know in your field when it comes to pollution, toxic substances, and how they impact human health, public health, for instance?
Yeah, thank you. Actually, that was a very nice introduction, because, of course, chemical pollution is one of the also major factor that affects biodiversity, and it's sometimes a bit forgotten. Climate change is often more named in this context, but in many contexts, chemical pollution are just interlinked with climate change and biodiversity loss. We are studying mainly the impact on human health. I'm collaborating with researchers at the Karlsson University who run a big pregnancy cohort, the SELMA study, where they measure chemicals, endocrine disrupting chemicals in pregnant women, and then look at the health outcome of their children. And what strikes me there the most really is that we see clear effects of clear associations between exposure to these chemicals and, for example, decreased IQ, which I think is also contributing to other crises, which we have talked about today. And there I can make some examples. For example, one chemical that was standing out in one of the studies was bisphenol F, which is the replacement of the BPA, which is used in these BPA-free products, and exemplifies really this, what we call regrettable substitutions, introducing new chemicals with very little toxicity data for old ones where we know that they are harmful. Or also when we looked at mixtures, mixture exposure, which of course is the real life exposure that we see in this normal population, Swedish population, that about above 50% of the children in this population are at risk that there were impacts on their brain development. So I think this is something that we shouldn't forget and really be careful when introducing novel entities, so to say, into the environment.
Thank you very much. Marika, your research is focused to a large extent on solar cells, but you're also the chairperson of the Unicorn, which is a part of Unify that the vice-chancellor talked about. Which are your reflections when you think about what you have heard now about the triple planetary crisis and what Frank talked about, planetary politics and scholar activism, as Aarti mentioned and talked about? What does this mean for Unicorn, for instance?
I'd like to talk a little bit about the needs for research and the need for good, I think, to start with, multidisciplinary research. And what Frank said, dive deep. We dare to dive deep into the questions. So we need scientists with a deep knowledge that dare to dive deep. And then when we have identified these scientists, we need to bring them together and they need to start talking to each other. Because I think there is a risk in these questions that you have a deep knowledge in one area and then you're asked questions about another area. But you shouldn't maybe answer those questions. You should rather reach out to someone that you know, which you already collaborate with, and you should answer these questions together, because that would give a better answer. And I think that's the idea with the Unicorn in one way, is to identify these conflicting goals, these wicked problems, and then reach out to others. So in the first phase now of Unicorns, we use a kind of a feeding system to bring scientists together with their specific questions, where they are supposed to talk about their identified goal conflicts and then reach out to others. And so there's a kind of shaping a togetherness in these questions, which are really important. And the setting at an institute with the freedom to choose, total freedom to choose the how question, but also the what question to start with, but also have challenge-driven questions where you maybe are giving the what question, what to do research on, what challenges do we have ahead, but let the scientist decide how.
And in this, the how, when you talk about also not only what the individual scientists focus on, but when you want to bring them together, is that one of the points that Aarti Gupta referred to in scholarly activism?
Yes, absolutely. And I stand with you absolutely on the geoengineering. Actually, Sweden has today 10% more solar energy coming into Sweden because of lower emissions and the cleaner air. So that's something that's very, very concrete for us working with solar cells. We should look at modern irradiation data. So that's and I think we also should dare. That's the dare to dive deep. Also dare to speak up is in this as well.
Like to, well, I'm standing very close to you because of the camera. Gabriele, it's nice in many ways, but what would you say? I want you to reflect on this concept of activism in the panel. Do you feel comfortable with that? Would you describe yourself as, I often say I'm active, so hence I'm an activist, but.
So I think it's important to distinguish between different forms of activism. I don't necessarily advocate public activism in the sense that, you go out actively in the media or social media with an opinion, but I think that activism in some form is useful. And my personal choice, and then, I think that every scientist should choose the form of activism that they're more comfortable with, is what I think of as targeted activism. So, for example, with Mikael, we organize some events where we target politicians and decision makers. I have worked with various private sector partners, mainly, for example, the insurance sector, but also the energy sector. And so making targeted communication to actors which you think are particularly important in your field to make your point and describe your evidence-based stance. Then I have full respect for other colleagues that perhaps are more comfortable with the more public sphere and then want to go out broadly with an opinion, as I said, in the general media.
But I've seen you on the television and I listen to you on radio quite often as well. So.
Yeah, but I would say that's more a reaction rather than proactively looking for interviews. So obviously, if I get the opportunity and I get asked to do it, I'll do it. But I don't actively look for that communication channel, I would say.
Thank you, Jakob.
Well, I was sort of inspired by some of the comments made by our speakers that. The issues about the ivory tower. I started out, I've always been studying evolution, right? And when I started out my career, I know that there's a Wikipedia page on me. I haven't written it myself, promise, but someone else did. And it describes me as someone who studied the mating system of the great snipe, a little obscure wader that you can find in the north of Sweden and the northern hemisphere. And I was interested in mating system evolution. And after a while, I got more and more sort of into endangered species. And instead of, I think I shifted from the focus of speciation, what makes more species, to try to focus on what makes species go extinct. And then it was sort of evident that this is something that society is perhaps more interested in than the mating system of the great snipe. And I think there is a...
You were seeking attention, is that what you said?
No, but it's more that I think it's important for scientists to reflect on societal needs. And what can your science do for society? It's something that every scientist should reflect on, I think.
Thank you. Joëlle.
Yes, so I came with a huge rucksack here because I was on a trip in, among others, Paris last week, where I had a meeting at the OECD for discussing new test methods for chemicals. So in this sense, I'm definitely actively involved in societal discussions. And I also think for me, it's very important to be active in different discourses and in different ways. I think when it comes to the question of chemicals and maybe also in other topics, it's also important to discuss what message to bring to different parts of the society. For example, in the big PFAS question, which certainly everyone here in the room is familiar with. One issue is really to over and over again say how dangerous these chemicals are, and in particular during prenatal life and so on, because we have these chemicals now in our environment, and for a pregnant woman, for example, it is completely impossible to avoid them. So me saying over and over again that these chemicals are to be avoided when you're pregnant is completely unnecessary and just puts blame on the wrong people. So I think it's important also to always reflect on how messages have to be packaged when talking to different groups of people.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Marika, when you reflect on this activism concept, do you think is it used as a word as sort of label to put on scientists to criticize them and say that you're not so scientific because you're active, you're an activist?
Yeah, and that's of course the balance. We have as scientists, we have a very high confidence. In Sweden, at least during the pandemic, the people were thinking more and more better things about science and scientists. So we have a high confidence, and of course, being an activist in a more aggressive way can maybe lower this confidence. So we have to care about the confidence that we have built and build, and we can make small progress on this confidence, but it's easy also to destroy confidence. It's like turning a hand. You can do that. So I think that's the balance. And when I go out and talk, I'm very careful with facts, and I also try to balance what I say, and there are pros and cons and so on. But we should not always, as a rule, bring in the other side. If the other side is minimal and there is only one person thinking something different, we don't have to bring that person into the room if there is a very high majority thinking something else. That's my stance on this.
Yeah. I think this is really an extremely important point, because this is exactly what this is used from, in our case, the chemical industry, to kind of dilute the message, to say like, but there's, of course, as scientists, as you say, we have this, we are careful, we try to kind of say like, until now we know, and these kind of things. But this is then used as being like, but the scientific community is not even, there is inconsistency in the data, there is not even an agreement. And this is exactly the point where then the kind of this scientific discourse can be used against us. And I think that is, I would be very curious later on how the second point on this list is forming a coalition among scientists can be done without having this argument.
Mm-hmm. Jakob?
Well, being an evolutionist, my science is actually questioned, and especially in the age of Trump. Mm-hmm. There are large parts of the American society and the public, and also the political establishment, that disagree with evolution, and it's a fact. I mean, it's not something that can be debated. There are all these sort of ideas that there are alternatives, and scientific creationism and all that sort of things. And it's important not to get involved and start to agree with people that say that there are alternatives. Of course, there are in any scientific endeavor, there are different opinions, but questioning the basics is not, and start to argue with people that questioning the basics not for scientific reasons, but for ideological or political reasons, that's not fruitful.
You mentioned if there's a single person, one individual, don't bring that person into the room or whatever. Well, Frank talked about one specific individual person who happens to have a lot of power right now on the other side of the Atlantic. Being involved in blocking the plastic agreement, never been interested in biodiversity, and saying that climate change is a hoax and invented by the Chinese. So to link this a bit to what Frank talked about, planetary politics, how much can be accomplished actually when you say it's impossible, Joëlle, to get rid of these substances, the perfluorinated substances? They are indeed out there already. We're changing as humanity the course of evolution, and mixing and changing the climate. What do you see being in the natural scientific domain as prospect for governance? Is it? Do you see any hope, Gabriele?
Well, I must say I've become more and more pragmatic with time concerning climate governance, and my current stance is that it's very much linked to economic incentives. So perhaps I've sort of abandoned the more idealistic stance of that there is some sort of chance of working together for the greater good. And now I'm in a phase where I'm thinking if the right people see money in climate action, then it will happen very swiftly and effectively. Then maybe in a couple of years' time, I'll have shifted opinion again.
Marika.
Yeah, and I'm not a political scientist, so it's very difficult to answer this question. I think that's why we have the people who really do research on this, and I'm eager to listen to how we should do this and have it evidence-based, because again, as a scientist, I dive deep in solar cells. That's where I dive deep. That's where I'm rooted. But I'm not rooted in political science. I want to learn about political science, but I like to hold hands with someone who is rooted in political science. And I think that's where he or she can learn from me, and I can learn from them.
But Marika, is your science ever questioned?
Yes.
That it's a hoax, or it promises too much, or what's the
promises too much? Indeed, and of course we have proven ourselves a lot.
And what do you answer then?
Pardon?
What do you answer when people question what you're doing? What's your answer?
I can say solar today produces more kilowatt hours than nuclear power, and that's a fact. So that's what I can say. But I don't know if that's the right thing to say.
Yeah.
Or so.
Are you ever diminished? Because that happens to me a lot of time. You know, when I talk about species extinctions, people say, "Well, you know, it's a little birdie there. Doesn't matter." The whole.
But does it matter?
Picture.
Now you have the chance to answer. How does it matter?
Yes, I think it does matter. I mean, you can always make a joke about it, or sort of try to diminish that. It doesn't matter if whatever bird disappears from Sweden, but it's when you the collective evidence. So there are. I looked at the species portal, the Swedish species portal today. There are 217 species reported extinct in Sweden in historic times. 217 species extinctions. So it's a fact. I mean, we lose a bird here. Perhaps it doesn't matter, but 217, that's a sign of something. And when we look at it globally, it's devastating.
And if you look in forest ecosystems, the red listed species are 2,000.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So,
Joëlle.
Yes, I wanted to come back to what Marika said. I agree. I like to collaborate with people who can analyze this side of the other side of the coin, or how do you want to say? But I also think that within especially our communities, like our natural science communities, we can also kind of collaborate together. And to be honest, when it comes to the chemical question, my biggest hope is really on awareness for each other's, for kind of new technologies, what kind of issues come with them, and addressing them very early in the process, and not when we are already kind of there and it's too late. So I think that is.
Mikael, is it allowed to ask Joëlle a question?
Yeah, but I think Gabriele has been sort of.
Yeah, no, maybe I just wanted to refocus a bit. I mean, we're talking a lot about communication, but do we feel that there is still a role for new research and new results, or do we know enough? And is it only about communication? A bit of a provocative question to us in the panel, stealing Mikael's job here, because I feel a lot of what we're discussing is how do we communicate, but do we have enough to communicate? Should we only focus on communication, or do we still need new results?
I mean, what I was talking about were more like research interactions, where we actually in the process where new materials or new solar cell materials are developed, we already do the tox testing so that we don't have to do it later and so on. That is, to me, research still. In the PFAS, for example, I think the whole focus should be not on taking to get more research data, but just to kind of try to get, hopefully, in some way, rid of the stuff, and also take legal action so that we don't have more.
Yeah. I mean, it's fine if you ask each other. I wanted to warm them up for 10 minutes, and I thought they couldn't continue by themselves. So, Jacob, Jacob, you have a question to Joëlle.
Well, it's just a reflection on science and or what we call scientific facts. I do recall that the person who, I shouldn't say invented, but the discovery of DDT, he was awarded the Nobel Prize once upon a time. So DDT was once upon a time thought to be a massive scientific achievement. And Joëlle, you know more about the devastating effects of DDT than I do. So the scientific knowledge, actually, that needs to be considered. That it's not, some things are facts, written in stone. There's things that we shouldn't really get ourselves involved in. But a healthy scientific debate and having a view that we can actually change our minds, I think that's important as well. That we acknowledge the fact that things can be different when you look at it from another side.
But Paul Müller got this Nobel Prize, but then we didn't know about the chemical pollution crisis, and today we know about it. And I think we could draw conclusions today by comparing these fluorinated substances with the fluorinated. We're repeating the same mistake, but at the same time, when the bans came towards DDT and PCB, the levels have gone down, not completely to zero, but to a large extent. So we know that policies are working, don't we? Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And yes, and from this point of view, policy work or governance is, of course, a very important issue to drive as well. But I would also say, as Marika said, that is, I'm happy to engage a scientific expert, and maybe I would not dare to advise how to make incentives or how to these kind of.
But are you criticized as well, as Jacob is telling us, for sort of speaking out or for being active? Do you meet that from colleagues in science?
No, I don't.
Or?
I think I would say that in my field it is very common that people engage in the question in different ways.
Gabriele, what would you say?
Well, I mean, perhaps
when you have your targeted activism, it's even more well thought through than perhaps just speaking.
Yes, and I think a lot of people, especially if one thinks of politicians, are a lot more reasonable when they don't have a reporter listening to what they're saying. Many politicians, my impression, Mikael, you would know better than I do, is that they say a lot more sort of extreme things when they're speaking to a newspaper or on TV than when you speak to them on an individual level, and they know that no one's going to take notes of what they say. So in a sense, that can be a sort of positive and optimism message, that this targeted communication can have effects that one doesn't reach when one speaks for a public medium. I perhaps also wanted to lift another aspect, which I think is central to today and also to Frank and Aarti's work. And that is the fact that governance needs to take a holistic view. So now we've spoken about 3 different aspects of an ongoing sort of global crisis. And it's not always the case that maximizing the gains for one of these 3 elements necessarily is equally good for the other 2. And so I think obviously now at Uppsala University, we have Unicorn, which is a research institute that deals with this question. But I guess from a global governance point of view, it is also important to think about how to balance often competing interests. I'm sure perhaps Frank, you have thought about this problem in your own work. And so how do we do this? And how do we make sure that the researchers in the individual fields that maybe don't necessarily all have, a broad interdisciplinary view, understand that maybe the best course of action is not necessarily the one that has the most impact in their narrow field of expertise?
You want to comment, Marika?
Yeah, I can give an example, and it's about energy and food. Of course, that's the goal conflict, which is, of course, very important for us. And if we just take solar as an example, then there's a low-hanging fruit to put solar cells on farmland. So our research now is what happens if you combine farming and PV on the same fields. Is that good or bad? And what science do we need? So, of course, agriculture is needed. PV scientists are needed. The farmers themselves are needed. So we need to talk to them. What works for them? How wide apart should the PV panels be for them to be able to have machinery around not only today, but maybe tomorrow? And what type of optics do we need? So down into the physics. So there's a lot of research there. And here's an example of where you really have to combine different competences to get to the same, to a good research question and answer it. And maybe the answer is we shouldn't put PV on farmland. Maybe that's the question. So that's where we have to be objective in our research. It shouldn't be to prove that it's possible. It should be to investigate if it's possible and have an objective research to target that question.
And would you say that Uppsala University is 550 years almost? Would you say is the structure optimal for stimulating these types of collaboration?
No, I don't think it has been. I think we have been very much focused, diving deep just where we stand and not holding hands. So I think if we can get more holding hands, I think it's better. But also because we have now identified maybe more questions that need this research approach, that we need this multi and cross and interdisciplinarity in order to answer these challenge-driven questions.
Joëlle, you wanted to comment?
Yes, I of course agree. And I think we shouldn't forget that we also have another very important duty, and that is the education. And also there, I think we could be much better in actually taking advantage of the fact that we have all these disciplines present, and should have more awareness in terms of educational activities also built into the different curricula, so that we can, because I mean, it's one thing to build this research consortia interdisciplinary, but I think it's also already in the education very important to be aware of the different aspects.
Thank you. So we talk now about science, activism, and transdisciplinarity and linkages to governance, etc. And I think we should invite Frank and Aarti to come up and join the panel and give your comments, brief comments, and then I think we open up. And while you come up here on stage, I think we can give the panel so far an applaud. You're staying here, but so welcome up. I still see some energy in the room. Everyone is waiting for asking a question or two, but let's give an opportunity first to Frank and Aarti to comment. Who would like to start? Aarti?
Thank you. I just... Does this work?
Yeah.
No.
Does it work now? I tried both options. Does it work now?
Fully close. So reflections on what the panel said. They are activists, more or less, even though they don't want to. Some want to label themselves in that way, and others perhaps in a slightly different way. But
yeah, no, thank you very much for those reflections, and also for sharing your own expertise and perspective on the questions you research. Well, there were a number of observations about the scholar activism side of things, so I could comment on that. Then I also had one or two remarks about the triple crisis, etc. I think one, I was struck by what you said, Gabriele, about target activism. I think that sounds very, and of course, an efficient use of one's time as well. You know, you focus on where you know your message might land and be taken up. But I think that also raises the question of, you know, who has access to that kind of target activism in some sense, because, you know, so we are, in some sense, we are also an elite academic initiative. We have access with our very critical perspective because we are based in, you know, in sort of elite university institutions. We have credibility as senior scientists, etc. We might have access to policymakers, and others whose ear we would like to have, but sometimes not everyone has the choice to, you know, sometimes you're forced into the public arena and into social media and into arenas where that's the only option to bring your critical perspective. So if small Global South NGO had exactly the same position that I espouse, they may not have the access. So that's just one thing. I think this idea of covert versus overt activism is a very important one. Many of you might have read Roger Fielke's book on the honest broker. He talks about the different roles that scientists can take. And he talks about an issue advocate, which I guess that's me. I take a position on a specific issue. And one of the most important categories he talks about is the stealth issue advocate. Somebody who's taking a position, but is not making clear their position.
You mean an economist? Sorry.
Yes. Well, yeah. In this case, you know, scientists who would suggest they are taking a position, but they say this is the objective perspective, and you who have a different view are offering a normative position. Whereas, of course, we are all have our normative commitments. So I think there's an issue about, you know, who has the avenues and the access. And in a way, bringing a critical perspective is sort of a David-Goliath fight in some sense. And I think that's an important experience we've had, even if we have this particular initiative does have that sort of same elite access that the other the advocates might have. And I think there was another important discussion about whether one should look for balance. As a scientist, do you point out, you know, on the one hand, here are a set of considerations that could be another set, there's another way to look at it. And I think on this particular issue, we have also found that we articulate our perspective because there are also many, many arenas where those who have a different view are very loudly putting forward their view. So when we have a few resources and the capacity to bring our perspective into important arenas, that is not for us the moment to invite the advocates in, because they are not our audience. We are not trying to, they are already convinced. We are trying to convince the people on the fence or those who will make decisions. So I think it's also a matter of who is your audience there in some sense. I can talk about this for a while.
Maybe
I will stop.
maybe you can, Frank. We will have more time to come back to this. Thank you, Aarti.
Thank you so much for being here. Thanks so much for the insights. I think one advantage of the Zennström professors maybe also to bring you all together in a panel, because I think you really impress. You mentioned holistic, that we understand the problems, and also for the social science, then we picked out the solutions, and then we need to do it all together. And we need to bring all the communities together. Because one thing I realized when I looked at all of you in your different disciplines, we have one concept in social science which is called problem shifting. And that is quite often that we find situations where there's one community that looks at an issue from their perspective, tries to develop a solution, and then the solution ends up as a problem for the next person.
Exactly.
And that is kind of, if I look at all of, not of you personally, it's discipline, like for climate. I mean, we want to get the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. What do? We're planting forests like crazy, which has a huge impact on biodiversity. And then you get there. And then we want to fix the climate problem by building batteries, which has a negative impact on pollution, but also, and this is not represented here, on human rights, for example, where do you get all the minerals? So there's so many problems that are being shifted around, and that is a clear argument. We need to have holistic solutions, but also the rector has left. We need to have also a holistic university. I think that's very important to bring together disciplines, to have much more collaboration among natural sciences, but also among natural and social science. I think this makes also Zennström professorships quite important to be located here to allow collaboration with natural and social sciences. Can I have one more point? Okay, one more point. But I don't know. One point I think is very interesting from the scientific perspective is, and that is a bit related to Aarti's point, I will bring it a bit more sharper maybe, is what are the limits of science? No, not very sharp. I mean, in different directions. What are the limits of science? I think that's a very, very important point. When it comes to the chemicals, to us, to what extent can we really analyze the toxicity of certain substances? And we can, of course, but normally the industry is always quicker. That's kind of when they have developed 100 substances and we kind of are still on the first analysis. And that's one problem. The solution could be to ban an entire category of substances, even if you don't know what the harm is. And you can say we don't know the harm because we had no time to analyze, so let's ban them all. And that's the question for the limitation of scientific analysis and of knowledge. And the same is also the case, and that comes to the point of the solar radiation management. To what extent do we want to know that this is actually possible? And this is one of the big debates also played out in journals sometimes. There are some people who say solar radiation management is potentially possible, and we are scientists, so therefore let's study it. We want to know. That's what I hear from quite a few scientists. And those of us who are more critical, we say, we don't need to know. We know it's dangerous, and just knowing it will be a problem that we are shifting to biodiversity, climate, human rights, all kind of other, even solar energy. So therefore the question is, what are the limitations of scientific inquiry, scientific freedom? Do we agree that there are certain areas where we just say we don't do research on these areas? And what do we do then if some scientists say, but I want to do research? And that is kind of a very, very complicated thing that can also add to Aarti's presentation, that this is quite controversial even on the lips of toxic, because what we are essentially saying is we don't want a certain technology to be researched because it's very, very dangerous. And that has a huge reaction from those scientists who want to research it. Anyway, there's so many views, but it's maybe also good for the audience participation in a sense. Should we have limits on science? Should we have limits on what we want to research? Certain areas where we say this is not what we should investigate if we are a responsible university, or is everything possible? We just have to find some funding in Silicon Valley and then we go.
Thank you very much, Frank. And you passed over to the audience, and I think we should do so, or as said in Sweden on Christmas Eve, stämningen kräver att. So we have these things that we want you to talk in, otherwise the audience online will not hear you. Are there any questions or comments, but not speeches? Because then I will have to block you. Maybe here, please introduce yourself as well. Maybe if you take notes, we can take 3 comments or questions, and then to take the next.
Okay.
Yes.
Oh, sorry. Hi, my name is Hanna Soldal, and I work at ACT Church of Sweden, which is Church of Sweden's international aid organization, and I focus on advocating for climate justice, and both by engaging our members on the matter, but also by policy dialogue with decision makers. And we have seen that the present Swedish government has closed many, many doors to dialogue with the Swedish civil society. So I wonder what the situation is like for scholar activists. Do the decision makers want to maintain the conversation with you? Or, I mean, our perception is that they focus almost mainly on business solutions. So we work a lot on that.
Thank you. I think that was an excellent question, because it was a question and it was relevant and it was brief. So just set the standard for the rest. We have one there and one more up here. Yes.
Oh, thank you. Thank you to Aarti and Frank. My name is Charles Parker. I'm a professor of political science here. And my question is about the post-Trump age. But first, my question to you is I think it's smart that you focus on the age of Trump and thinking about planetary protection and the role of global governance without the US. So do you have hope for the EU to fill this gap? EU and China, EU subnational cooperation in the US, for example, with California? And then, of course, things in politics can change fast. Should we also think about preparing for the post-Trump era as well?
Thank you very much. And then it's Niklas here.
Thank you so much. I've had the privilege to see the unfolding of the non-use agreement that you mentioned, Aarti, and Frank is also involved with. And I must say it's been a fantastic experience to see the power of this community that you've created come together. And I really think it crystallizes a lot of what you're saying in the kind of being explicit, right? In saying this is calling out basically the pretense by so many in saying we're neutral on the one hand, on the other hand, as if that's a sort of non-normative position. While what you're doing is you've normalized and taken back the precautionary principle. You've said that, you know, to say no and reject something, like we do with eugenics, we do that with human cloning. There's things that are off the chart, off bounds because they're too dangerous, and in this case, non-governable, is a very sort of commonsensical and precautionary position, and dramatically shifted that whole discourse. So I really appreciate that, and I think that just is the least, in a way, political, right? Because you're very clear on what you're doing. As you said, the sort of the disguise is really the problem when people pretend to be neutral but aren't in fact. So I guess my question is the precautionary principle. It seems to me very, very key, and it would be interesting to see your view of that unfolding in your work.
Thank you very much. So we have a question about Swedish government post-Trump, and if we can believe in EU and China meanwhile, and the precautionary principle. Anyone who wants to comment on one of these? You can't all comment on all questions because then that's it for the rest of the.
Perhaps I can
Gabriele.
comment on the first question.
Yes.
And there I fully agree. One does see quite radical shifts in what sort of message hits home depending on the current political climate and on the party one is speaking to if one thinks of politicians. And my personal take is that as scientists, we are hardly going to have the power to change governments or sway elections to any large extent. And so my personal take is that the clever way to handle this is to, as you said, adapt your message so that you keep the scientific value in it and you keep the practical value in it, but you bring it from a perspective that you think will hit home with that particular part of the political spectrum. And I think that's the only reasonable way to approach this.
Thank you. Jakob?
I think it sort of depends on what the issue is as well. So like I tried to allude to during my previous attempts here, there's some things that can't be debated and shouldn't be debated. And some things that are debatable within the scientific community. And I guess my question to the speakers is there how can we identify issues that should not be debated and issues that are subject to debate? I think that's it's difficult.
Thank you. Marika, you wanted to comment?
Yeah, I can comment on if it's not so easy to go to the country politicians or the parliamentarists, try the local level, because some of those are the future parliamentarists. So I think starting locally and also engage locally can be a first step at least. And Swedish Church is also part of one of our research consortia and on solar energy. So they are also involved in our research.
Thank you. Frank?
Well, I can take the point of the chance. Thank you so much for pertaining all the planetary politics. I mean, number one is, of course, whether Trump is a permanent or semi-permanent development. Is it a Trumpian moment, as Aarti has said, or is it a Trumpian age? And that is a question I can answer. But right now, I think it is pretty it points to the direction that this is not a fleeting movement, but we really have a long-term transformation of the global political system and that matter. The EU, I think I didn't mention it that strongly in the talk, also because I don't want to focus too much on the EU, because it's not a European event as such. But I think it's tremendously a case when the European Union has to get its act together and show global leadership. I mean, it's clear for many issues, but certainly also for climate, biodiversity, and all the other issues. The European Union really has to get its act together, which is quite a challenge in the way they're working on this very hard. And you mentioned subnational. I had actually a slide on it, which I took out because time was limited, which is a very, very important development. And it has already happened in the first Trump administration that a lot of positive change was possible outside Washington, D.C., which is the state of California, which is one of the largest economies in the world that has taken a lot of action. Collaboration of Europe with the North England, the New England states also, and other actors. So this, I think, is definitely an avenue to pursue. It has been done in the first Trump administration. It's very important. And the second Trump administration, civil society, the role of courts, the role of some philanthropies of the progressive side. So I think there's a tremendous potential to work with the American nation, not necessarily with the current American government. So I think there's a lot of space. Collaboration with China, India, of course, this is for, I mean, you mentioned China, but I think India is even more obvious a case in a sense because it's a large democratic country, but it's also not easy. I mean, I talk to many people in the civil society community. I mean, China is not a democratic country. And I talked to many people and said, can we work with Modi? It's also not the most progressive political ally in a sense, and maybe more aligned with Trump in many ways. So these are very, very difficult times, but certainly Europe has to build alliances with big countries in the global south. That's what I hinted at in the beginning with these new alliances that are outside the old bloc transformation, confrontation, and really bringing together novel coalitions of countries in ways that we have not been used to in the last 80 years. But we have to work into this direction as politicians, as scientists, meaning also more collaboration with different countries, and also as civil society.
Can I just follow up there? Because about the global system or like-minded countries, after the COP meeting in Copenhagen in 2009, when the meeting actually didn't conclude, that was done a year later, it was said that, well, UN has died, like-minded countries need to move on. And then we had the Paris Agreement, which was extremely successful in terms of, countries coming together and so. But I guess you see the situation now is fundamentally new.
Of course, it's not fundamentally new because the United States is no longer part of it. I mean, it's new because the biggest country is not part of it, number one. And number two is actively opposing. I mean, that is a situation that we're also not really used to in a sense. We have an example, which is the International Criminal Court, where the United States is really trying to undermine a plurilateral institution. And that is probably happening also in many of the sustainability domains. And that means European, Chinese, Indian, Brazilian, South Africa alliances are very, very much needed. And this is not used for many of the European diplomats. I mean, of course, intellectually they all know it, but it's not the daily practice that they have done so far. Everybody looked always to Washington. And now we have to really build stable long-term coalitions with countries that have not been in these coalitions for a long time, number one. And number two, also not the easiest political partners in many ways. I mean, like China, human rights violations, etc. On the other hand, you need them for climate governance. I mean, that's kind of a new type of collaboration that Europe has to work on in a world of authoritarian and sometimes very unpleasant governments.
Thank you. Aarti.
Thank you. Yeah, I think maybe I'll pick up on the question from Hannah in the Church of Sweden. I think at the moment, in terms of access to policymakers on this particular issue that we're advocating on, we still have that access because it's an emerging issue on the agenda, and European governments, for example, want to figure out what their position should be. But I think the important point also here is that it goes beyond, it's about, this is a global scale technology. So it goes beyond Europe and the United States. It's about global South governments. And in fact, this is an arena where actually the EU could, and picking up on what was being said about alliances and new alliances, this is a very, very important issue where there could be an alliance between African group of countries and the European Union. They're very much and this goes a bit to what Niklas was saying as well about the precautionary principle. On this particular issue, there is a transatlantic divide which preceded Trump, and there have been other transatlantic divides in novel technologies like genetic engineering, etc. So this is an issue absolutely ripe for cooperation between, cutting across the North-South divide. And I just had another point just about picking up on the conversation around the precautionary principle and when do we know enough and are there areas where we should not do research. I think those are things that we've really grappled with, some of these big questions about, can we as academics actually say we don't want the pursuit of knowledge in some area? And this is what we are often accused of, is that we are choosing ignorance. And that is a polemical statement from the other side saying that, but I think it is very important to know, and that's why, like I was saying, we continue to do research, and it's a very complex challenge. We are taking the position that at the moment we know enough to say, don't do it, take it off the table. That in and of itself is controversial enough for challenge. We're saying we know enough, even though it's something that lies in the future. At the same time, we are continuing to do research about how we can institutionalize non-use and how restrictive global governance is not such an unprecedented idea as was being said. So we look at human cloning, the restriction of chemical weapons, anti-personal landmines, all kinds of things where the global community has decided we need to restrict something. And so there's enough to learn from. And that's what we try to emphasize.
Mm-hmm. And of course, it's possible to govern based on lack of knowledge as well. That's what you normally do when you pick mushrooms. You don't eat the ones you can't identify. You treat them as toxic and not as edible. And that's the precautionary principle. And I guess, Joëlle, for you, that's very central, because you cannot, as Frank said, study all the tens of thousands of perfluorinated substances where the cold chain is just added a bit further and you jump after. So is it sufficient research? Do you have sufficient research today, would you say?
Exactly. So I mean, for certain groups of chemicals, we have advocated for a long time that they should be taken as groups, restricted as groups, and treated in the different legal systems as groups. I have to say that, I mean, I think this is very important, but this is again kind of governance. I'm very fascinated of the question of how much should we use this principle in science as well. And I'm thinking of how, how to implement this also in a way, I mean, in other ways. And you are saying with with this network, for example, which is very impressive. I will go and sign myself in as soon as this is over. But I mean, of course, it's kind of addressed in when we apply for money, right? The ethical questions.
There is a call right now from Formas for May for chemical substances and precaution. I think
that's too. But I think like in terms of the ethics of our own research and potential dual use and so on, it seems to me though that when you have to write something about this in your research applications, it's often not really, it's not taken serious by the person who writes it and not by the evaluators either. So I think here one could actually do more about really kind of asking these questions seriously, because in the end, I think if you get money if it's enough that a few people want to research on it, get money for it, and then the research is done, right? So it's up to the universities, but also other funders to say no at some point. And I'm not sure whether the system we have at the moment is good enough to regulate ourselves, so to say.
I see a couple of you want to comment, but maybe let's throw in a few more from the audience. We have one here in the front. Yes, and please introduce yourself.
Hello, my name is Fernand de Noël, and I'm co-chair of the climate students here in Uppsala. My question regards to essentially the Overton window, which is the amount of subjects and topics that are politically acceptable within society. So like this window can shift, and as climate change intensifies, We expect tougher times than before. So my question is, say, in nowadays world, it seems that when things are tough, the perspective shifts more towards right-wing societies or authoritarianism. But how can we as scholars and as activists, at the very least, increase the diversity of ideas that are radical and can be spoken to as part of the solution?
Thank you. And then you give the microphone here.
Hi, my name is Wendy Broadgate, and I'm at Future Earth. It's the world's biggest network of sustainability scientists. Earth System Governance is under our umbrella, so we're really delighted that Earth System Governance is here in Uppsala now. My question relates to the discussions about lobbyism, the lobby attacks that can happen on scientists, also on activists. What's the role of synthesis or consensus in science? Consensus in science. Should we have more of it? We have IPC, IPBES, they're very long and slow. Is there an appetite for more synthesis, and can that help us with our activism and kind of counter the industry lobby?
Thank you. And then we have one up here, the third one.
Hello, thank you. My name is Jörgen Sjögren. I am a senior lecturer in restoration ecology. Being a natural scientist myself, I'm very much a slave under the measurable. And I would like to hear if you have any good measurements or metrics to measure the impact of scholar activism. That could be effects on, for instance, the issue at hand, but also on the credibility of the scholar engaging in activism.
Thank you. Gabriele, you raised your hand before as well. Do you want to comment and maybe link to some questions?
Maybe something I can link to the first question on politically acceptable topics. And this is linked to the idea of how we decide whether we can and should conduct research on a given topic or whether ignorance is better. And I think we've been perhaps in our discussion mixing a bit two different concepts. One is the precautionary principle, which doesn't mean that one shouldn't conduct further research in all contexts. I mean, in climate science, for example, we often refer to the precautionary principle in the context of saying we know our climate models aren't perfect. We are not able to say whether it's going to be, 3 or 3.1 degrees warming under a given emission scenario. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't act, even though we don't have full and perfect knowledge. So that's an example of an application of the precautionary principle, which has nothing to do with restricting research on a given topic. Then there is this question of what are acceptable topics to work on, partly linked to politics, partly linked to own internal discussions within the research community. And I think there's been some very good work in specific fields, notably in medicine, on how to set up a system for review of the ethics of specific research areas to decide in a systematic and as objective as possible way what are topics that we should just drop and not work on. And so I think perhaps that's what we can take inspiration from. And I agree that we should try to decouple the research perspective on what we should and shouldn't research on as much as possible from the political perspective of what we should and shouldn't research on. I think those are two completely different things, and we should try from our side as researchers to hold the two as far apart as possible.
Aarti, what's your view?
Thank you. I was busy thinking about my answers to the other questions, but maybe I missed, is this working?
Yeah. Okay. Or you can take the questions you were thinking about.
No, that's I'm white. But maybe I missed your last sentence, but were you saying that what scientists can and should research is a separate question from a political decision about what should or should not?
No, I'm saying that we should try to hold it a separate question. So, for example, if politicians decide that we should research on geoengineering for purely political and economic reasons, we shouldn't follow that necessarily. We need to have our own evaluation within the scientific community. That's what happens with medical ethics. Maybe in some cases, some pharmaceutical companies would like for some unethical research to be conducted for financial reasons, but we should not have our ethical evaluations affected by a political or economic interest.
Yeah, I think that has a lot of different elements tied up together. And I think one of the questions is this an issue? What does research on this topic even mean? Are we talking about, the technology, developing the technological capability? Are we talking about the social, political side of research, of the ethics of it, the human rights considerations, the geopolitical risks? So what kind of, and is it then really possible to have that kind of separation in this particular issue? I think that's a little bit, that's sort of challenging to know whether, and I wanted to, maybe I'll go back to, so what is the window? This was a question about what is the window, what is acceptable shifts? And I think that is an important point, and that perhaps relates to this idea of, and just a comment about the notion of crisis. This panel is all about the triple crisis. And I think when one uses the notion of crisis, it opens up, in some sense, there are various crises we are in, but who leverages a crisis scenario for what end? And this is sometimes a crisis is politically risky, and it expands what is possible and what might be tried and what might then be tried, which is undemocratic and unjust in the name of an emergency. That can be quite, I think that's something we always need to a little bit keep in mind. And I think there was another question about deep dive and radical rethinking of what we need to actually, what is the underlying sort of interlinkages between these crises. So we can talk about trade-offs and problem shifting, etc. But I think one underlying issue, I'm often struck by the fact when we talk about the triple crisis, that we don't talk about a fundamental contextual condition, which is perhaps the overarching crisis, which is a crisis of inequality, which underpins a lot of what why we are not able to address these triple crises. And why do we not see the obscene inequality we have today as the global crisis? So anyway, I just thought that if we want to do a radical rethinking of what is possible or not, it's really a political question about who's benefiting from action or inaction today in all of these fronts.
Thank you. Frank, do you want to comment on how to measure, for instance, or did you?
Later in the mingle session, but I want to pick up one point. I come back to this. One point is the societal decision on science. I tend to disagree, maybe. I think there are certain scientific possibilities that require societal consent. I think certain issues which are so fundamentally changing our planetary system and the future of mankind, such as geoengineering, I think should be outside the scientific realm and inside the societal debate. So I think these are decisions where society should get together, everybody democratically, and decide, is this the direction to pursue? Is this knowledge we want to have? What would happen with the knowledge if we had it? Or is it something that we should rather ban? I think this kind of but I get also your problematic. I think it's a good point to have maybe more discussions here in the unicorn context or any other context, because these are really fundamental questions for the future of a university, which is 550 years old. So to really debate these issues, what is the role in the university? And then coming back to the point that you made, because the point is, I mean, many of these issues are really so fundamental. We need radical solutions. I mean, that's kind of certain climate which you are studying. In a sense, you have either the very extreme scenario of geoengineered planet, or we need to have a much different discussion about the needs for reducing the emissions and changing our lifestyles. And these are very fundamental discussions that are very much affected by university. And I come back to Wendy's point about consensus. Ideally, of course, we should have consensus. And that's why, for example, in climate, the IPCC was set up, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The idea was to bring together hundreds of scientists, put them in a room like that, and let them roast there for 2 weeks, and then they're coming out with a consensus. That's the idea. I think it's important. But we should also understand that the stakes are becoming so high, financially, economically, politically, in terms of helium, but also the phase out of coal, the phase out of oil, the phase out of gas, and it becomes really a top political issue that we cannot really believe this is just neutral science. It will be politicized. And I know from our own experience at geoengineering, we see the lobbyists, we see the money flowing in, we see the political conflicts. We have seen it for climate for so long. It's climate denied, finance by industry, etc., etc. So just believing in neutrality of objective science, I think it's naive. And these matters when it becomes so central for economic actors, for political actors, that we have to understand science also as political enterprise. The IPCC as essentially a political actor. Political and the politics that are being played, which issue comes into the IPCC, which issue is not in the IPCC, which working group, even is it working group 2 or working group 3 or working group 1? I mean, some of these issues are so, it is political discussion. We have to put it in the sense of how you frame it. And so there's a lot of politics and scientific assessments. I think that's very important to understand it. Also, for the natural scientists, you know, in political science, we kind of used to politics. That's kind of what we do for the rest for the students. But also for natural scientists. Natural scientists are also, in a way, political actors. By how they shape consensus, how they deal with consensus, how they work with technologies, and what are the technologies to look at. And I think that's an important thing also for Unicorn and for the university and for CCFL and everybody who's concerned here to study. This could be maybe a great seminar series at some point to have about the role of university and of Uppsala and these important discussions and where everybody is positioning him or herself.
Thank you, Joëlle and Jacob. Then we have one person in the middle and one there. And then I think it's time to go for some drinks and snacks. Joëlle.
No, I want to continue there also to your question, because I think not many natural scientists or generally maybe are aware of this, you know, the seeding doubt kind of cons or strategy of industry to really use exactly what we see as strength to always be careful about talking about our scientific results and so on, and instead saying like, so the conclusion is more research is needed. So even the scientists don't even know really if this is true or not, and so on. And I think it is exactly what we maybe consensus, yes, but we can as scientists never. I mean, I think it's more important to really be aware of how to communicate in different rooms, and for that, again, I think that's great to when you're already an established scientist, but I think even more so build that into the education as well. And then I would be very interested. I think we should definitely have a panel discussion on academic freedom versus responsible science. So that will be interesting.
Great. Thank you. Jacob?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on credibility. So I once, I think 10 years ago, I attended a meeting in London at the Zoological Society, and one of the speakers had to rush his presentation because he was attending the Extinction Rebellion protests that were they were happening in London, and you know they blocked the entire city, and there was lots of turmoil around this. And I also know that many of my colleagues in ecology and evolution and genetics, they sympathize, for example, with Greenpeace. And of course, these people can be, or some of them were depicted as radical leftists and, you know, sort of idiots and so on from certain political parts of the arena. But I don't think that any of these, my colleagues, were actually suffered internally, scientifically from their standpoints. They might be depicted as less credible from the non-scientific community, but not internally. But I just a couple of weeks ago, I watched a clip on YouTube with J.D. Vance attacking all professors. Sort of the war against professors. And I think we're all accused of being stupid radical leftists. So at some stage, what you discussed in your talks, I mean, the whole scene has changed, and the whole university system, the academic system, is challenged, and we're depicted as a sort of and it's not objective, right? So our objectivism is challenged, and I think that's dangerous. And so I worry less about credibility and being depicted as someone radical than I used to be.
Maybe such criticism is just a signal that you're doing the right thing. Two brief questions directed to one person in particular, in the middle there. Yeah, brief one, because we need to wrap this up.
We'll keep it short. Thank you for the interesting conversations. My name's Kevin. I study commercial law. I'm a student here. Questions about scholarly activism. So I run a campaign called Plant-Based Universities Uppsala. We have about 1,000 signatures, 200 of which come from academics at Uppsala University. And last week, Uppsala Student Union became the first student union in the Nordics to call for their university to adopt 100% plant-based food catering systems. The environmental discourse is often focused on energy systems. A lot of what you've spoken about there is on the sort of political or social level. My question is, to what extent do you think that academics should demand that the institutions they work at take concrete climate action and environmental action in practice beyond the scope of the research which comes out of those institutions?
Thank you. And the last question up there.
Thank you. Thank you. Hi, I'm Simara Johnson from the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences. And my question is actually to Unicon, I think, or the natural scientists here. And I was thinking, and I put my hand up before Frank talked about science being political, and you might not agree, but I think it has political implications. Your facts had political implications. And you were talking about interdisciplinarity and the importance of holding hands. And you said you cannot speak for others, which I agree, and that you need to dive deep. But I'm thinking, if you really want interdisciplinarity, don't you need to be a little shallow too and broaden out? Because I mean, to kind of see how those
brief
facts...
question, please.
Yeah. So don't you? So that is the question. Don't you think you need to broaden out in the sense of acknowledging what kind of political implications those facts have, because all those facts are value-laden?
Thank you.
So would that change political science in any way, do you think?
If you want an answer, we need to ask the panel, Marika first, and then I give two brief comments to Frank and Aarti before we wrap it up, okay?
Okay, I try to be brief. I think that's a super good question. And I think when I'm holding hands, I'm acquiring this shallow knowledge that you're talking about. So I think we should be seeing ourselves as T-shape. And in the scope to starting multidisciplinary, I think we build cross-disciplinarity because that's a little bit another thing. So I think that's the whole point. I become shallow, but I become something in the other areas by holding their hands.
Thank you. And now it's a contest. Who is briefest, the most condensed in his or her answer? Women first.
There's probably one by
Aarti.
Okay, maybe I'll only comment. Sorry, maybe I'll only comment on the credibility question then, because I think that is really central. I love the idea of having a panel on academic freedom versus responsible science. I would just call it academic freedom and responsible science. And I think the question is, I think you were also commenting in your example that you're less worried about credibility because, you know, maybe it's seen as a scientist seen as credible by non-scientists, but not so much. And I think my experience has been, in fact, even the opposite, perhaps. The non-scientists see us as a very authoritative voice on this matter, credible scientists speaking with the credible, authoritative voice. It is a certain category of scientists, and especially those who have a very different view from us, who would like to suggest that we are not credible. So I think that dynamic, and that's of course then a political dynamic. And Yeah, and I think there's also the question of who one deals with, who one doesn't deal with. So we don't get into discussions with chemtrailers and conspiracy theorists, even if they might ostensibly also have a similar position. But I think I will stop there.
Great. Thank you. Frank.
I want to be very brief. Number one is I think universities have to be active, and I wouldn't say activists necessarily, but active in these spaces. I think it's very important universities are doing more than just producing academic papers. They have to be agents of change. And I can say from Utrecht perspective, just kind of my normal university, when I'm not a Zennström professor, we are vegetarian. And Utrecht University doesn't serve any meat. So if I would be invited from the rector of Utrecht University to lunch, it would not be any meat, because that's what we don't do anymore. We have a flight policy, but vegetarian is very much a basis. The debate is always, is it vegan or vegetarian? This is kind of then the philosophical debates, and I'm out of that one, but we're not serving any meat. And I think these kind of things are important, despite there can also be debates about between red meat and chicken, etc., whatever. Number one. Number two is, I think interdisciplinarity is very important. We have to understand science as political endeavor. I think that is very, very important. I think it's very important to hold hands. And this is what you mentioned with the attack on science. And this is in America, of course, extremely strong, where you are not allowed to use words such as climate or justice or gender. And I heard even the word woman is not allowed anymore because it's politicized anyway. So, and this is a trend in one of the biggest countries in the world, but these political movements are coming across the world. That means that universities have to hold hands, and we have to protect each other in these difficult political times, and understanding that there are many political actors who don't want to have climate research and don't want to have research on chemicals and have a different view about biodiversity. And it's very important to stick together on that level. And yeah, that's kind of.
Thank you very much.
I'm very happy to be here.
Yeah. So sorry that not all of you who have raised your hands, I guess there are 10 more persons here who wanted to ask questions, haven't had the opportunity to do so, but we will have the mingle activity outside, and you can get hold of the panelists there. So thank you for coming also online. Thank you, Zennström Philanthropies, for making this entire thing with Zennström visiting professors possible, which is the basis for this seminar. And thank you to the panelists, and also for two great inaugural lectures. So let's give the panel an applaud and some gifts.